Hi, I'm Tara McMullin. I'm a writer, podcaster, and producer, and the author of What Works, a comprehensive framework to change the way we approach goal setting. And I really dislike advice. I have a personal disposition against giving or receiving advice.
So we're not going to get advice out of you. So how
No,
did this happen though? Like who like did somebody give you like really crappy advice sometime, or you just like, you know what, I fought the law and the law won, or what?
no, I think it grew more out of always being asked for advice and sort of recognizing that while I could provide context and I can provide different ways of thinking about a question or a topic or a need, my position to give advice is always going to be really flawed. And actually, there's a philosopher named Agnes Callard who has a great article simply called Against Advice. And she talks about how, we can have coaching, and coaching has this value in a very intimate one-to-one relationship. I get to know you, you get to know me, I can coach you, right? And then there's sort of the how to side of things. And so if there's a really objective process, I can walk you through an objective process. But advice tries to combine the objective, sort of transactional bit of how to with the transformative part of coaching, but it doesn't have the ability to deliver on either. And so when I read that for the first time a few years ago, I was like, that is my philosophy. And I had never heard it put in words exactly like that, but it's such a perfect framework, I think, for thinking about advice and advice culture in general.
Wow. So I should start by asking, so Tara, what advice do you have for me? Is that better?
Yes, I mean, that would be great. No.
That's funny. Well, as someone who does podcasts and writes a ton of articles and has a fantastic book, I like that you're against advice, because this book is not advice. It's a framework. And
Hmm.
I think that's super different. Many of the books, self-helpy, personal development, because we don't actually help ourselves. We get help from the author. So personal development, all of those are often, they pretend to be intimate. I call it the illusion
Hmm.
of intimacy, right? And instead, I love that you actually call it out in your book and you call it a framework. So congratulations, first of all, on writing a wonderful framework book instead of an advice book, Tara.
Thank you. And I am very glad that it read not as an advice book because that was important to me.
Yeah, and it really did. I love that you close the chapters with questions, that you've got things that we can do. Did you, by the way, I noticed that you said that you practice drawing. Are the drawings in the book from you, or
Mhm.
did you have, oh, cool. They're really
Yeah,
good. So
they're
you do
just
all your
little
Instagram ones,
doodles.
you do all these?
No, so a lot of what I post on Instagram comes from Canva. And I find Canva just like a super tool for helping me think through ideas visually. And for that, I'm less inclined to like get out my Apple Pencil and my iPad and come up with stuff. But for the book, they were original.
Wow. Very well done for being
Thank
a
you.
self-taught artiste. I love it. That's really good.
Yeah, I mean, I'm super inspired by like the visual thinking folks or visual note taking folks who can, script out an entire talk in little diagrams and figures. And I think that is so incredible. I can't do that, but I can totally crib their style to make concepts more accessible.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely accessible. So, do you have a favorite? My favorite is Mike Rohde. Do you know Mike Rohde?
No.
Oh yeah, he's the guy who wrote the first book on sketchnoting some 11 or
Oh,
12
okay.
years ago. He did work with David Hennemeyer Hansen and the folks at 37 Signals. He illustrated
Cool.
their books.
Oh, nice, nice, nice.
So yeah, so cool. Do you have a favorite, or do you just like the style?
I don't. I just like the style.
That's cool. That's super fair. So good. Well, let's dive into talking about the book then, because there's so much. I was telling you in the green room there that I took pages of notes here to prepare for this interview, which is unlike a lot of other books that I've read. Not a lot, but a good number of other books that I've read. And one of the big concepts that I thought was interesting to me is this concept of self And it's not like
Mm,
you say, who are you, Tara? And you say, well, that really isn't enough. Like you're really a network of self.
mhm.
So can you explain that concept? Because I think that'll be helpful for folks like me who struggle finding out who we are and answering that in a succinct way.
Yeah. So I borrowed this concept from another philosopher named Kathleen Wallace, and she talks about the network self as being sort of this agglomeration of all of our different identities, biological identities, sort of interest identities, but then also social identities as well. And sort of seeing the self as a multiplicity rather than a core unchanging thing allows us to recognize the different ways we show up in different situations or different phases of our lives, right? And it also shows how we can sort of add identities in, and also how sometimes we lose identities over a lifetime, or we shed, maybe is a better way to put it, identities over the course of a lifetime. I find this a really helpful concept because I am very much, socially, I'm kind of a shapeshifter. Being an autistic person and being very good at masking most of the time, it's my sort of default way of showing up is to just sort of be whoever I think the other person wants me to be, or to be whoever the situation kind of calls for in that moment. And that can be really alienating. It can be something that can create like a lot of distance from my sense of self. But this idea of the network self allows me to see that while, I might not want to shapeshift all the time, I might not want to mask all the time, that part of what I'm bringing into a social situation, or, whatever context it might be, is a true identity of mine. And as long as I can keep that identity connected to other identities that are important to me and not dismiss those other identities, then I'm still bringing myself into whatever context I'm in. But I'm not kind of, uh, I'm not losing myself in that context, and I'm not losing myself in any one given identity. I also think that the network self concept is really helpful from a personal growth perspective because it allows us to imagine the identities that we might want to take on, the identities that are enticing to us, and it kind of invites us to think, oh, well, what would it be like to hold this identity? Is that something I actually want to pursue? Or is that something that maybe it looks good on paper, or I've been told by culture or economics or political systems that I should be this identity, but I don't really want to invite it into the rest of my network. So I think it's really helpful in that way too.
That's so interesting. There's so much there that it takes time, and the complexity of self, I think, makes a lot more sense, right? The network of self, instead of just, nope, I'm this. I'm a podcaster. I'm an author. I'm a speaker, right? I'm autistic, whatever it is, right? I think that's fantastic. So as we look at that, then so how does that then play into goals, or I guess maybe a different type of goals, because you see goals more as commitments. So does self play into that, or how does that work?
Yeah, one of the questions that I really love asking myself and encouraging other people to ask is, who do I want to become? And so that kind of plays into this idea of like, what identities might I want to bring into my network as I get older, as I learn new things, as I experience new things? And for me, then identifying those identities helps me understand what kind of habits I might want to try out, what kind of routines I might want to try out, what kind of practices do I want to involve in my life. And for me, as you said, I am less about setting particular goals, like SMART goals. That's not what this book is about. This book is so not about SMART goals. But instead, it's really about thinking, how do I want to show up on a daily basis? How do I want to show up for myself? How do I want to show up for my work? How do I show up for the people in my life who I really care about, and for the planet, and for my community, right? And in, making those commitments to show up in that particular way, you are exercising a form of selfhood, a form of identity creation. And that identity creation then helps me, it helps me grow. I mean, just to be like at the very baseline of what we're talking about here, it's a path into the future. It's a dynamic path that doesn't assume that I have some sort of fixed or static being, or fixed or static mindset, but instead that I can change and I can grow and I can become who I want to become, even if that's just one tiny little new identity that I want to take on.
That's cool. That's really cool. I love that, and I think that is much more empowering than just setting a goal and knocking it down,
Mhm.
right? I mean, that's almost checklist goal setting, which I guess some people get much pleasure from checking things off on a list. I don't know that that's necessarily me either. So that's super interesting. With that, let's talk a little bit more about goal setting
Mhm.
and about practice, because I thought that was really interesting. As a sales trainer and someone who works with a lot of sales managers and such, practice is often leading to performance.
Mhm.
And you talk about the purpose of practice is two things: it's presence and perspective,
Mhm.
which is super interesting. And I think that does play into that. So, can you talk a little bit first about presence, and then we'll shift into perspective?
Sure. So the thing about practice, and when I use the word practice, I mean it like you would have a yoga practice or a meditation practice or a prayer practice. And my background is in religious studies originally, and so often I find these concepts kind of creeping in from places that you wouldn't necessarily expect. But I have also found that practice is really empowering in terms of work as well. And so a lot of the context that I bring to the book is around work, but it expands beyond that as well. But in terms of like the presence of a yoga practice or the presence of a meditation practice, the practice there is paying attention. It's noticing what's happening in any given moment. It's being curious. And it is that sort of nowness of the moment in which you are present and in which you are practicing, where you are grounded, you feel connected to yourself, you may feel connected to the environment around you as well. And that is a profoundly sort of subversive experience in the 21st century, right? In the 21st century, there are all sorts of things pulling us out of that sense of presence, out of that sense of truly paying attention to yourself and your environment. And so for me, practice is really kind of allowing myself to set that stuff to the side. And just to give you like a super concrete example of this, it can be as simple as, I used to have my Gmail inbox open in a browser tab all day long, right? And I would see that little notification number go up. And, I know that I don't have to check that, but there it was. And so what would I do? I'd get pulled out of whatever I was working on and I'd go check my email. Why? So was it just last year? No, 2 years ago now. 2 years ago, I closed the tab and I was like, I'm going to check this once in the morning and once in the afternoon, and that'll be it. Well, today I check my email about 4 times a week. I rarely check it on a Friday. I check it around 1 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And you know what? There's just not that much that I need to pay attention to in my inbox. But what that allows me to do then is to be fully present in my writing practice. And so, I am often asked, well, how do you make the time to write as much as you do, to read as much as you do? It's not about the time. For me, it's about the presence. I've always had the same amount of time, but I did not always have the same amount of presence.
Wow. So that's interesting, because I have now taken to when I'm interviewing someone, when I'm having a conversation, I shut my Slack down.
Mhm.
I make sure there is no email tabs, no other websites. Maybe the guest's website is up. I might have that, or their LinkedIn. Typically not LinkedIn though, because that notifies me too. But I'll have very little up, and I can tell you it makes for an even better conversation.
Mhm.
So I really, I think that's great. So with that, let's move to that perspective
Mhm.
piece of that, because I think that just the way that we look at things is very interesting, and as that relates to practice, I think that might help people.
Yeah, so perspective, I for me, a lot of this is combating the urgency that is just so pervasive in our culture, in our economy, pretty much woven into everything in our lives. So much, again, is vying for our attention that everything feels urgent. And when everything is urgent, we don't have the ability to step back and really understand or take a clear perspective on whatever it is that's in front of us. When we have multiple things vying for our attention, we can't very easily have a clear perspective on those things. So again, for me, practice is really about resisting urgency. It's resisting the need to do more and more and more, to do it faster, 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 and instead allowing myself the time and space to have a clear perspective on what I'm thinking about or what I'm doing. And again, the piece of like closing the tabs down, turning the notifications off, putting things on snooze or do not disturb or whatever it takes, that's going to help with that urgency piece too. Because, like I said earlier, that number on my Gmail tab is not urgent. It is just not urgent. And with podcasting, with our podcasting clients, we often say there is no such thing as an emergency in podcasting. Every so often there's an actual emergency, but rarely is it like an emergency that requires an immediate response. And so, we're very firm with our clients that it's like, you should not expect an immediate reply to an email. Your question, your problem is important to us, but it's also not urgent. And so, trust that we'll take care of it, and trust that it's not going to happen immediately, and that's okay. But we're able to do that because we have the perspective, we have the distance from the work that we do to be able to say, you know what? This isn't as important as you think it is. And that's really hard in the beginning for people to get used to. But as soon as they're used to it, they love it because our perspective is helping them find perspective. Our practice is helping them craft a practice.
Yeah, finding that peace and finding that practice are beautiful things, and they're not they don't come easy though. they're
No.
they're practice in
Yes,
themselves, right?
absolutely. Absolutely.
Cool. So with that, there's a lot of different ways we could go. But as you're talking about perspective, one of the things in your book, what works, that really stuck out to me that connects to that is letting go of discipline.
Mm.
I was like, no, hold on. I don't know. I don't get that. I don't know if that connects. So connected for us, Tara. How do we connect letting go of discipline to the practice and the perspective and the present moment?
Yeah. So discipline, I mean, it's right there in the word, right? It is a sort of antagonistic word. What does it mean when we discipline something? We rein it in, we punish it, we construct boundaries around it and fences around it, we discipline it. Um, and yet we use this word to talk about our relationship with ourselves and our work and our bodies and our minds. It's like, why do we make this idea of punishment and constraint a word that then we apply to every area of our lives? I mean, I could go into why that is, but we're not here for a linguistics lesson or like a language philosophy lesson. Um, Regardless, this idea of discipline doesn't serve us. because it instead of focusing on what we should be doing or what we're punishing ourselves, we could be putting a lot more energy into a much more positive, and by positive I don't mean positive thinking, but I mean constructive, generative, something with real substance. And for me, it's this idea of buying in. So I talk about buying in as essentially getting excited about what you say you're going to do. To me, discipline says you don't really want to do this thing. You're punishing yourself in order to do this thing. I would much rather find that morsel of excitement and motivation for whatever it is that I need to do. And I don't mean to be Pollyanna about this either, because I apply this to all sorts of things that I don't want to do all the time, but I apply it via perspective in ways or to things that, or I for myself, I connect those things I don't want to be doing to something that is truly important to me, something that I am 100% all in on. And as long as I can keep that connection in check, I don't need to discipline myself. I can say, yeah, I'm going to bang this out this morning or this afternoon so I don't have to think about it again because I really don't want to. But I'm going to do it because I want to do the thing that it is connected to. I want to move that project forward. To me, that is way more motivating than discipline. I don't want to be reacting to something. I don't want to be punishing myself. I would much rather find the thing that I want to do and do it for that reason.
So you're not a sadomasochist.
No,
Let's be clear, right?
I'm
You're
not. No.
Okay, good. Just want to be clear. Okay, good. All right. Now that we got that out of the way, no. So you mentioned positive thinking, though, and I kind of loosely titled this episode "The Problem with Positive Thinking" because early in the book you talk about somebody gave you this Norman Vincent Peale book or quote all about positive thinking. So for you, Tara, what is the problem with positive thinking?
Yeah, the problem with positive thinking, like sort of in a nutshell, is that it erases the context of us being human beings that are complicated and live in systems and have relationships and have all sorts of things that influence our ability to do X, Y, or Z. And so positive thinking as a sort of movement wants us to believe that everyone has the same opportunities, the same potential to have a good life, to make money, to put a roof over your head. The list goes on and on. And when you get into these, when you get into all of the thinking or all of the sort of messaging around positive thinking, you'll see over and over again the way these authors deny the lived experience and the systemic influences on the people who read those books or listen to those talks or hear those podcasts, whatever it might be. And it's not to say that, I'm against thinking positively. I am against the positive thinking movement as it erases people's lived experience. And I sometimes I'm shocked to pick up a book, open it up, and just see someone blatantly blaming, a lack of success, a lack of money, a lack of happiness on a person's disposition, personality, character traits, as opposed to locating their difficulty in very real systems of oppression and systems of harm. And as a individual responding to that, like reading those kinds of things or hearing those kinds of talks, that's a situation where we do start disciplining ourselves, right? Because we're told it's me, I'm the problem, it's me, right? And so I try and change myself. I try to change, these characteristics of who I am or what I'm about or the systems that I'm in, as opposed to addressing the needs or the addressing the real constraints that are imposed on me from the outside. And when I stop seeing those things and all I see is what I perceive as faults in myself, either I delude myself into positive thinking, or I get really down on myself, And I think um, one of the books that was very influential on me as I was writing my book was had come out just a month or two before I started writing. It's called Confidence Culture, by by a sociologist and a media theorist. And this book is really looking at the ways in which women's perceived deficit of confidence is something that is imposed much more from the outside than it is something that's actually internal. And sort of pushing back on this, well, really, all you need is more confidence. You just need to think more positively about what you're able to do in this world and like show up with all that razzmatazz, right? Like, okay, that doesn't actually help if I'm in an organization that doesn't respect women's ideas. It doesn't help me if I'm in an intimate relationship where my partner thinks that I'm less than, or thinks that my career isn't as important as his, right? Those are real structural issues that impact our ability to do the things that positive thinking says we should just be able to do by changing how we think or changing our mindset.
Yeah. I've only recently begun to understand that, and I've done more research on that, because that is it's so interesting. The system is rigged against us. It'd be like saying, you know what? Just because you can't, carry a car 100 miles means that you're less than.
Yeah.
It's like, no, I'm not I'm not a flatbed semi. That's not what I'm built for. That's not, the system has just worked against me. So that's so interesting that you talk about that. And I think that is a important concept to get out there for folks, because it isn't just thinking positively. It is really, which you can do. That's great, right? But
Yeah.
positive thinking of itself is not enough. And I think that's a
Right.
great lesson.
Yeah, and positive thinking, I mean, we can think of it as an ideology, just like any other ideology. There's a set of beliefs, there's a set of norms, and those beliefs and norms are really trying to create a particular culture and a particular affect within a group of people. And it's not helpful. Individually, you might see great results from that. But as a response to the world, it's not helpful on a social level. And I love that you brought up like the idea of, carrying a 2-ton car over your head, or 150 miles, or however you put it, because another piece of that kind of positive thinking ideology is this like no limits kind of BS, right? It's like, of course I have limits. I'm a human being. And not only do I have my human limits, but Tara McMullin, have limits. There is a limit to, for instance, the amount of socialization I can do, or the amount of socializing I can do, because of how I am wired and because of what exhausts me. I have limits to the amount of hours I can do deep work, right? Because we all do, because mental energy is a renewable resource, but we better take time to renew it, right? And so for me, accepting my limits, identifying them, using them to say, no, this is a hard boundary for me. No, I can't do that. I am at capacity. To me, that is profoundly empowering in a way that positive thinking just can't touch.
Absolutely. Constraints help us be stronger once we're aware of those constraints. So
Yeah.
I love that. And I am so with you there. I am not a fan of the bro culture and the whole culture, if you will, right? That does not play for me. The whole hustle, hustle, hustle. No, like, come on.
No.
We have to slow that down. So, so before I ask you the last question, I want to invite folks to get to know Tara McMullin a little bit more. I want to encourage you to get a copy of What Works, a comprehensive framework to change the way we approach goal setting. I want to encourage you to check out her podcast, get her newsletter. She's at explorewhatworks.com. I'm signed up. I follow her on Instagram. That's how we connected. I love her book. and love what she puts out there. So, Tara, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you to close us out here. So, what works?
What works is asking questions, being curious, and actually paying attention to what comes up when you're curious and when you're asking questions. What works is experimentation. It's practice. It's presence. It's finding what satisfies you. Um, yeah, for me, that's what works.
That's awesome. I love that. Well, friends, if you're looking for a better framework or a different framework or just a new way of looking at goal setting, get a copy of What Works. Get to know Tara McMullin. She's got a lot more insight than I was able to glean today because we only have so much time. That is a boundary, friends. Remember, find out what works for you and work within that. Ask questions, get curious, and be present with yourself. You can find what works today.